April 14th, 1865. The night that an actor played his most infamous role, an assassin. John Wilkes Booth changed the course of history in Ford's Theater with his Derringer pistol. His goal was to reignite the Confederacy, to rise up against the Union, but his plan backfired. Booth was a successful actor and member of the Know-Nothing Party, discouraging immigration into America. Booth aided in the capture and execution of John Brown, a white man who led a slave uprising at Harper's Ferry. He supported the institution of slavery and condemned Abraham Lincoln, the president who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Booth devised a plan to kill the president, restoring glory to the Confederate cause after the South lost the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at 10:15 p.m. in Ford's Theater. The Confederate sympathizer expected to be a hero by reigniting the Confederacy with the death of the president. It was at 10:15 that Booth signed his death warrant. The president was dead. He had to flee. But would he be a hero? Booth would soon realize the tragedy and irony of his actions. It was not his legacy that was solidified. It was Lincoln's. Booth leaped from the balcony where the president laid with a bullet in his head. However, Booth broke his leg when he landed, which would hamper his escape.
Sic semper tyrannis!
Thus always to tyrants. These words rang as Booth escaped to Bishop's Alley outside of Ford's Theater. Waiting for him was a horse that would take John Wilkes Booth away. The beginning of the 12-day manhunt had begun. Booth raced down the street, heading out of D.C. He approached Navy Yard Bridge, where a guard stopped him. He explained to the guard that someone had stolen his horse and he was chasing him into Maryland. The guard let him pass. Minutes later, Booth's co-conspirator, David Harold, approached the same bridge after failing to kill Secretary of State Seward. Harold gained access across and caught up with Booth. The pair continued on to the Surratt House to get help from the Confederate underground. The conspirators reached the Surratt Tavern around midnight. Mary Surratt's Tavern was a safe house of the Confederate underground. Booth and Harold helped themselves to some whiskey and celebrated, allegedly proclaiming, "Pretty certain that we have assassinated the president." This was Booth's highest point, when he still believed himself to be a hero. Booth had to address his broken leg. Down the road from Surratt Tavern is the farmhouse of Dr. Samuel Mudd. He was a known Confederate sympathizer, and upon receiving the assassin, set Booth's leg and helped the fugitives plan the rest of their journey. When later confronted about treating a traitor, Mudd argued that he had to treat Booth because of his Hippocratic oath. In aiding Booth, the phrase, "Your name is Mudd," came to be commonplace in American culture. Samuel Mudd's remains are at St. Mary's Church. Booth often visited this church while in town, and it is here where Booth and Mudd initially met. Refreshed by the care of Dr. Mudd, Booth and Harold carried on to the treacherous part of their escape, Zekiah Swamp. The pair had to cross the swamp to reach Rich Hill, where Colonel Samuel Cox would help them. The swamp was dense, and for a man with a broken leg on a horse, the trip was not easy. Booth and Harold then stopped at Rich Hill, the home of Colonel Samuel Cox. Built in the 1700s, Rich Hill was previously owned by Gusteau Brown, one of the doctors who cared for George Washington on his deathbed. Cox had his brother, Thomas Jones, aid the fugitives in the next step of their journey. Jones would harbor the pair in the nearby pine thicket. Authorities were hot on the trail of the assassin, and Booth was about to have a rude awakening. While in the dense pine thicket, reality hit Booth. He and Harold had acquired a newspaper. This paper called Booth a coward. The week in the pine thicket, after learning that his mission failed its objective, left him devastated and enraged. He did this for the Confederacy, yet was seen as a villain even by Southern sympathizers. The war was over, and Lincoln was viewed as the right man for American Reconstruction. For example, Lincoln proposed a lenient 10% policy, allowing the Southern states to rejoin the Union if 10% of voters pledged loyalty. His successor, Johnson, would not have such an easy transition in store. Johnson would pardon Confederates if they came and begged him, and vetoed legislation that would facilitate the growth of the Union. Burdened by this news, Booth and Harold shot their cumbersome horses and continued through the pine thicket on foot. A week had passed since they reached Rich Hill. Booth and Harold then had to cross the Potomac River. This is the spot where Booth stole a boat and set off to reach Virginia. It took them 2 times before they successfully landed. They needed help, and they hoped to get it from Elizabeth Quisenberry.
Hi, my name is Ralsby Quisenberry, and Elizabeth Rose Green Quisenberry was my great-grandmother. Yes, my great-grandmother. My grandfather was 2 years old at the time Booth shot Lincoln, and living on the home property with his mother and sisters. She made it clear that she did not aid him as far as providing him with a horse, and she made it very clear that he was not welcome to stay on her property. She did, however, send food, and with that food, sent directions on where they might be able to find transportation.
There is still doubt about the extent that Elizabeth Quisenberry was involved in the Booth escape.
When the question comes about, did Mrs. Quisenberry know of Lincoln's assassination and Booth's activity within the conspiracy? It's a little hard to say. They really didn't have email back then, but there was communication. And in my mind, I really don't have a doubt that she knew about the assassination of the president and that Booth had done it because of the great manhunt that was going on. There were probably federal troops in and out of her property at certain times looking for him.
After being shooed away with some food from Mrs. Quisenberry's home, Booth and Harold were sent to Dr. Stewart's home. He also gave food and also sent them away. This was another shocking encounter that left Booth with the realization that he was not the hero he thought he would be. Stewart arranged for Booth and Harold to spend the night in a freed slave's cabin. Booth was insulted. He had killed the president who emancipated the slaves, just to be forced to spend the night in a former slave's home because no white people would help him. Booth sent the former slave family to sleep outside while he and Harold slept in the cabin. Their journey was coming to an end. They headed further south. Former Confederate soldiers aided Booth and Harold to cross the Rappahannock River. The conspirators were desperate. After being rejected from another home in Virginia, Booth made his final stop, Garrett's farm. Richard Garrett welcomed Booth after being fed a lie that they were returning veterans. Garrett complimented their service. Booth and Harold finally received the praise they hoped for, but for the wrong reason. Booth and Harold were forced to sleep in the Garrett's tobacco barn once Garrett's son realized that they were not veterans. It was there that Booth's escape would end. Early morning, April 26, 1865, federal troops surrounded the barn. Booth and Harold were ordered to come out with their hands up. Harold complied, but Booth remained in the barn. To persuade Booth to surrender, the troops set fire to the barn. Booth intended to go out with a bang, preparing to shoot everything in his way when he exited the fire. A young sergeant saw Booth's intentions through the slots in the barn and shot him in the neck. Booth died that morning. Mary Surratt would be the first woman hanged by the federal government for her involvement in the conspiracy. David Harold hung next to her. 2 other men involved in the conspiracy were also executed with the pair. At 1:26 p.m. on July 7, 1865, the conspirators were dead. John Wilkes Booth expected to be a Confederate hero. When he shot Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater, Booth didn't kill a tyrant, but created a martyr, and solidified Lincoln's place as one of America's most popular presidents. The Confederacy was dead, and so was Booth. Reconstruction resumed with Andrew Johnson as president, a man whose ability to repair the United States paled in comparison to Lincoln's. Booth died a condemned assassin. Ironically and tragically, instead of reigniting the Confederacy, he hampered its reconstruction and secured Lincoln's legacy.
We'll get a new start.